My name is Adam Reeves, night shift DJ at Millstone Emergency Broadcast Station. When the missiles hit and the world went dark, I became the only voice still broadcasting across the wasteland. For 19 brutal days, I witnessed society collapse through my microphone as survivors desperately searched for hope in the static. This is how I kept transmitting when World War III turned America into ash. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I never planned to be the last voice on the radio. 3 weeks ago, I was just Adam Reeves, the guy who played classic rock at 2 in the morning when nobody was listening. Now, I might be the only broadcaster left in New England, and people are risking their lives just to hear my voice. I found this old video camera in the storage closet while looking for more batteries. Figured someone should document what happened and, well, talking to this lens feels almost normal after 19 days of talking to myself in the broadcast booth. This is Millstone Emergency Broadcast Station, about 20 miles outside of Hartford, Connecticut. Most people didn't even know this place existed before everything happened. It was built back in the 60s during the Cold War. Concrete walls 3 feet thick, backup generators, analog equipment that hadn't been updated since Reagan was president. The digital revolution completely passed us by. Management was always promising upgrades that never came. Turns out that saved our lives. The station sits on this little hill overlooking Route 84. Used to joke that our only listeners were truckers passing through at 3 in the morning. Now I watch the highway from the roof sometimes, just endless lines of abandoned cars stretching to the horizon. Some still have their doors open where people got out and started walking. The night before it happened was so ordinary, it hurts to remember. I came in for my regular shift, 11 at night to 7 in the morning. Greta, the station manager, was still there working late. Said something about schedule changes coming down from corporate. Marcus, the evening DJ, was packing up his things, complaining about the rain. "Hey, you see all those military trucks on the highway?" Marcus asked as I hung up my jacket. "Probably just another training exercise," I told him. The last few months we'd seen more and more convoys, but the news never mentioned why. Everyone was too busy arguing about celebrity scandals and reality TV to notice. Darius, our engineer, was in the back fixing the transmitter. Again. The signal had been cutting out randomly for weeks. He blamed it on equipment older than he was, but now I wonder if it was something else. Testing, maybe. Seeing what would still work after an EMP. "Should be good for tonight," Darius said, wiping grease from his hands. "But if it drops out again, just follow the restart procedure I showed you." I remember so clearly reaching for the door to the broadcast booth and Greta calling after me. "Adam, if anything weird happens tonight, anything at all, call me immediately." I laughed. What's going to happen at 3 in the morning in the smallest radio station in Connecticut? "Just call me," she said, not laughing back. My show that night was a tribute to Tom Petty. Played American Girl right at midnight. Free Fallin' at 1. I took exactly 3 call-in requests from insomniacs and night shift workers. The last caller, a woman named Lynn, requested running down a dream. She said it helped her stay awake during her hospital shift. I wonder if Lynn is still alive. At about 4 in the morning, the emergency broadcast system did a test. Nothing unusual there, happens all the time. Except this one lasted almost a minute longer than normal. When it ended, I noticed something odd. The system ran the test, but none of the standard messages about "this is only a test" came through. Just the tone, then back to dead air. I called Greta. No answer. I tried Darius. Nothing. Probably both asleep, I figured. So I put on breakdown, adjusted the levels, and leaned back in my chair. I never got to finish that set. At 4:17 in the morning, every single light on our emergency broadcast panel lit up simultaneously. Not a test. The system was designed to trigger for nuclear attacks, and in 40 years at this station, that had never happened. My first thought was that some technician had hit the wrong button somewhere. Then the messages started coming in, not from the emergency system, from other stations. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, all breaking format to report the same thing: bright flashes on the horizon, communications down in major cities, military aircraft scrambling. Then, one by one, those stations went silent. I grabbed the station binoculars and ran to the roof. To the south, where New York should have been, I could see an orange glow against the clouds. To the east, another one. The wind was blowing toward us, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that I could smell smoke. From over 100 miles away. I ran back downstairs, heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The emergency broadcast system was still screaming. The regular phone lines were dead, but we had an old hard line to the State Emergency Management Office. I picked it up with shaking hands. "This is Millstone Emergency Broadcast. What's happening?" The voice on the other end was flat, almost mechanical. "Initiate emergency broadcast to Protocol 7. This is not a drill." Protocol 7. I'd never heard of it before. We had a laminated card taped inside a cabinet with emergency procedures, but nothing about Protocol 7. When I told the person on the line, they just repeated, "Check the fallout shelter storage. The instructions are there." Then the line went dead. I remember standing there, holding the phone, completely frozen. My mind kept saying it was a mistake, a drill, a prank, anything but what it obviously was. Then I heard footsteps pounding up the stairs from the parking lot. Greta burst through the door, soaking wet from the rain, still wearing pajama pants under her coat. "You saw it?" she demanded out of breath. "The alerts or the explosions?" "Both." She pushed past me into her office, pulled out a key I'd never seen before, and unlocked a cabinet behind her desk. Inside was a thick binder with Emergency Broadcast Protocols stamped on the cover. The pages were yellowed with age. She flipped to a section near the back labeled Protocol 7 Nuclear Exchange. "I never thought," she whispered, then caught herself. "We need to get on air now." While Greta prepared her announcement, I tried calling my parents in Boston, my sister in New York, friends in Philadelphia. No signals were getting through. The cell networks were already down. Our internet connection was gone. But the radio, our old, obsolete analog radio station, was still transmitting perfectly. Darius arrived 20 minutes later. He'd seen the flashes from his apartment and immediately understood what they meant. Without a word, he went to the transmitter room to make sure we stayed on air. Marcus never made it back to the station. Greta's voice was the first one to broadcast after the attack. I still remember every word. "This is an emergency alert. Multiple nuclear detonations have been confirmed in major cities across the eastern seaboard. If you're hearing this broadcast, seek shelter immediately. Avoid windows. Fill containers with water while it's still available. Stay tuned to this frequency for further instructions." She repeated the message for an hour while I worked the phones, trying to reach anyone with reliable information. At around 6 in the morning, we got through to someone at the State Emergency Center. He told us Hartford had been spared a direct hit, but the electromagnetic pulses from the coastal detonations had knocked out power and electronics throughout the region. The phones and internet working in some places was just temporary. Systems running on backup power that would soon fail. "The governor's dead," he told us. "Lieutenant Governor, too. We're trying to establish a chain of command." When I asked who was responsible for the attacks, he laughed. A horrible, empty sound. "Does it matter? Could be the Russians, could be the Chinese, could be our own missiles launched by hackers. worlds ending either way. By sunrise, we could see the refugees. First, just a few cars driving way too fast on the highway. Then, more and more. When the traffic jammed completely, people started walking. From the station roof, it looked like a river of humans flowing west, away from the cities. I took over the microphone at 7 that morning. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely adjust the levels. What do you say to people whose world just ended? I had no idea, so I just told them what we knew, which wasn't much, and what we didn't know, which was everything else. We're getting reports that the strikes appear to be limited to military targets and major cities, I said, though we had no confirmation this was true. The immediate danger from the blasts has passed, but fallout may be spreading depending on wind conditions. I had no idea if this was accurate either. We had no weather data, no radiation monitors, nothing but rumors and common sense. Around noon, Darius rigged up an old TV antenna as a makeshift receiver for any signals still transmitting. We caught fragments of emergency broadcasts from inland stations in Pennsylvania, descriptions of chaos around New York, desperate pleas for medical aid from Connecticut hospitals whose generators were failing. The strangest thing was a clear voice transmission we received briefly from what sounded like a military aircraft. The pilot was calmly describing total infrastructure failure across all primary and secondary targets before the signal cut out. That first day we kept expecting official word. From FEMA, from the military, from anyone in authority. It never came. By evening, we realized we weren't just reporting on the emergency. For many people within our broadcast range, we were the only source of information they had. As night fell, I watched from the roof as the lights went out across the landscape. Town by town, neighborhood by neighborhood, darkness spread. Except for fires. There were always fires somewhere on the horizon. Greta found me up there, staring out at the darkness. "We need to conserve fuel for the generator," she said quietly. "From now on, we broadcast in 6-hour shifts. Have you heard from your family?" I asked her. She didn't answer, just handed me a list of announcements to make, shelter locations, advice about contaminated water, warnings to stay off major roads where the National Guard was attempting to establish control. That first night was the longest of my life. I kept broadcasting until my voice started to crack, reading the same emergency information over and over, because we had nothing new to share. When Greta finally forced me to take a break, I tried sleeping on the break room couch, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those distant flashes on the horizon. By the morning of day 2, the highways looked like a scene from a nightmare. Cars abandoned everywhere, some with doors still open, personal belongings scattered across the asphalt. People trudged along the shoulder in groups, carrying whatever they could. From our vantage point, they looked like ants fleeing a destroyed nest. We started getting visitors at the station around noon that day. First, just a few people asking for water or information about where to go, then more. By mid-afternoon, there was a small crowd in our parking lot. Most just wanted to know if we'd heard anything about their neighborhoods, their families, if the water was safe to drink, if help was coming. Darius rigged up a bulletin board outside the main entrance where people could leave messages for loved ones. We'd read them on air every hour. Names of the missing, meeting points, pleas for information. It wasn't much, but it was something. The first National Guard roadblock appeared on Route 84 that afternoon. 3 Humvees and about a dozen soldiers. They weren't stopping people, just directing traffic and taking notes. Greta went down to talk to them, came back looking grim. "They're tracking radiation patterns," she told us. "Eastern winds are pushing fallout inland. They're marking safe zones and hot spots." "Did they say anything about relief efforts?" I asked. "They're not here for relief. They're here for containment." When I went back on air that evening, I didn't mention the radiation. What good would it do? People couldn't exactly evacuate further. They were already evacuating. Instead, I focused on practicalities. Boil water before drinking. Stay indoors during rainfall. Don't eat fresh produce from gardens east of Hartford. The first call came in around midnight on day 2. Someone had found an old ham radio and managed to reach our frequency. A man named Paul from a town about 30 miles north. He told me the local reservoir dam was unattended and showing signs of strain from recent heavy rain. I broadcast the warning immediately, urging anyone downstream to move to higher ground. The next morning, we heard the dam had held, but just barely. Paul called again to thank us. That was when I realized what we had become. Not just a source of news, but a link between isolated communities trying to survive. More calls started coming in after that. People with radios mostly, but sometimes messages relayed by travelers who had heard our broadcasts elsewhere. We started compiling information, which gas stations still had fuel, where medical help could be found, which roads were blocked by abandoned vehicles or military checkpoints. By the afternoon of day 3, the highway outside the station had fallen eerily silent. The mass exodus had ended, not because the crisis was over, but because those who could flee had already gone, and those who remained had nowhere to go or no means to get there. The silence was broken occasionally by military convoys. Heavy trucks moving west, always west, never returning east. I mentioned this during a broadcast, wondering aloud where they were going and why. An hour later, 2 soldiers showed up at the station. They didn't identify themselves beyond liaison officers, but the message was clear. Be careful what we shared on air. We're not censoring you, the taller one said, but understand that civilians aren't the only ones listening to your broadcasts. Who else is listening? I asked. Whoever started this, he replied simply. Then they left. That night, we lost power from the grid completely. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out for good. Darius immediately switched us to generator power, but we all understood what it meant. Whatever systems had kept the electrical grid partially functioning were now failing too. How long will the generator last? I asked him. Maybe a week, if we're careful, he said. Longer if we limit broadcasts. So we established a new protocol. 4 hours of broadcasting, 8 hours of silence, around the clock. During the silent periods, we'd put up a sign outside telling people when to tune in next. The hardest part was deciding what information to share and what to withhold. Reports of looting in nearby towns. Yes, people needed to be cautious. Rumors of radiation sickness overwhelming the few functioning hospitals. No, that would only cause panic. News that National Guard units were abandoning their posts. Definitely not. By the end of day 3, our small radio station had become something none of us had anticipated. The only authoritative voice in a sea of chaos and rumor. People would travel for miles just to deliver messages they wanted broadcast, or to hear the latest news directly from us rather than passed along through the growing network of survivors. That night, I finally broke down. Alone in the broadcast booth during a silent period, I put my head in my hands and wept for everything and everyone lost. For my family I couldn't reach. For the world that had existed just 3 days ago. For the weight of responsibility that had fallen on us just because our outdated equipment still worked when everything else had failed. Morning came too quickly on day 4. Our food supplies were already running low. The station had a small kitchen with a refrigerator, but without power, everything perishable was spoiling. We had some canned goods and snacks from the vending machine, but it wouldn't last long for 3 people. We drew straws to see who would make the first supply run. I lost, or won, depending on how you look at it. At least I'd get to see what was happening beyond our hilltop station. Before I left, we had a staff meeting. The question none of us wanted to ask finally came up. Should we stay, or should we go? Greta had a sister in Vermont. Darius had parents in western Massachusetts. I had a brother in Ohio I hadn't spoken to in years. Each of us had somewhere we could try to reach, people we desperately wanted to find. The broadcast is what matters now, Greta said firmly. We might be the only reliable information source left in the region. My sister has kids, Darius said quietly. I need to know if they're okay. I sat there looking at the map we'd pinned to the wall, marked with the locations people had called in from, notes about road conditions, radiation zones to avoid. It already covered most of Connecticut and parts of neighboring states. We can't all leave, I finally said, but we can't all stay either, not with the supplies we have. In the end, we made a pact. I would stay at the station with Darius. Greta would try to reach Vermont, carrying a ham radio Darius had modified. If she made it, she'd establish contact and share information from further north. If the situation at the station became untenable, Darius and I would head west, broadcasting our route so she could find us. The supply run was my first time outside the station since before the attacks. I took our station van, one of the few vehicles still running because its older electrical system had survived the EMP. The nearest grocery store was about 3 miles away. The roads were like something from another world. Abandoned cars everywhere, some with doors open, some with shattered windows. Personal belongings scattered across the asphalt. Suitcases, toys, photographs. Things people had initially thought important enough to take, then abandoned when walking, became the only option. The grocery store parking lot was eerily empty except for an overturned shopping cart and a child's shoe. The front windows were smashed. Inside, most shelves were already bare. No surprise there. I grabbed what I could, some canned beans, stale bread, bottled water that looters had overlooked because it was warm and dusty in the back storeroom. I was loading the van when I heard the engine. A pickup truck came around the corner fast, 3 men inside. They spotted me immediately. I didn't wait to see what they wanted. I just threw everything in the van and drove. They followed. Not just followed, pursued. The truck was faster than our van and the driver knew it. He stayed right on my tail, honking, flashing lights. When I took a sharp turn onto a side street hoping to lose them, the truck pulled alongside. The passenger leaned out the window pointing something at me. I couldn't tell if it was a gun or just his finger. I didn't stay to find out. I drove straight into a residential area, weaving through abandoned cars, taking turns at random. Eventually, I lost them, but I was also lost myself. It took nearly an hour to find my way back to the station, constantly watching the rearview mirror. When I got back and told Greta and Darius what happened, their faces went pale. "This is why we need to stay on air," Greta insisted. "Without information, without some kind of authority, this is what happens. People turn on each other." That evening, Greta packed her small backpack. She had a map, some food, the modified radio, and a canister of pepper spray Darius had found in the station security office. We hugged her goodbye, not knowing if we'd ever see her again. "Keep broadcasting," were her final words to us, no matter what. After she left, the station felt emptier than ever. Darius and I established a new routine. One would broadcast while the other rested or kept watch. We moved a couch into the broadcast booth so whoever wasn't on air could sleep nearby. That night, I made my first solo broadcast without Greta's guidance. I tried to sound confident as I shared what little information we had, read messages from the bulletin board, and gave practical advice about purifying water and preserving food. But inside, I was terrified. Not just of the men who had chased me, but of the responsibility. "If you're listening to this broadcast," I said into the microphone, "you are not alone. We are still here. We will keep broadcasting as long as we can. If you have information to share, if you need help, if you're looking for someone, come to Millstone Station on Route 84. We've become a message hub. We've become a community. After my shift ended, I couldn't sleep. I went up to the roof and scanned the horizon with binoculars. In the distance, Hartford was completely dark except for an occasional fire. To the east, where Boston should have been, there was nothing but darkness. To the south, the same. I looked up at the stars, brighter than I'd ever seen them without light pollution. The world had been reset to a more primitive state in just 4 days. How long would it take to recover? Would we ever recover? Darius joined me on the roof a little later. "You did good on air," he said. "People need that steady voice." "I'm not steady," I admitted. "I'm terrified." "Then you're hiding it well," he replied, "which is exactly what everyone needs right now." Days 5 and 6 brought the flood of refugees. We thought we'd seen the exodus in those first days, but that was nothing compared to what came next. As conditions in the larger towns deteriorated, people who had initially sheltered in place started moving. From our hilltop vantage point, the highway looked like a slowly moving river of humanity. They came in every condition imaginable. Families with children carrying all they could in shopping carts. Elderly couples supporting each other step by painful step. Young men on bicycles. A group of college students who had formed a chain, linking arms so no one would get separated. Many were injured. All were exhausted. I started keeping a logbook, noting patterns in their movement. Most were heading west or north. Almost no one was traveling east toward the coast. When I asked those who stopped at the station, they all said variations of the same thing. The cities were death traps. No water, no food, no medicine, and too many desperate people in too small a space. A doctor stopped by around midday on the 5th day. Dr. Karen Chen from Hartford Hospital. She had walked over 15 miles after the hospital generators finally failed. The things she described had happened barely 20 miles from where we sat, but they seemed like reports from another world. The ICU patients died within hours of the power failure, she told me. After that, we tried moving everyone we could to the lower floors where we could use natural light to work. We ran out of painkillers on day 2, antibiotics on day 3. She was heading to her brother's farm near the Massachusetts border, hoping to establish some kind of clinic there. Before she left, she gave us a crash course in identifying radiation sickness and treating basic injuries. Darius wrote everything down in meticulous detail, and we broadcast the information during every transmission. That evening, the National Guard checkpoint that had been on the highway since day 2 suddenly packed up and left. No explanation, no replacement. Within an hour, we started seeing groups of armed men moving among the refugees, taking what they wanted. From our distance, we couldn't intervene, could only watch in helpless anger. During my broadcast that night, I warned people to travel in groups and avoid the main highways if possible. I gave directions to alternate routes, using old service roads and forest paths that Darius had marked on our map. I'm not sure if it helped anyone, but it was all I could do. Around dawn on day 6, a family arrived at our door. A man, woman, and 2 young children, maybe 8 and 10 years old. They were soaked from the rain, exhausted beyond words. The woman was feverish, barely able to stand. "We heard your broadcast," the man said. "You said you were a message hub, a community." We brought them inside, gave them water and some of our precious food. The children fell asleep almost immediately on the break room couch. The woman, her name was Sarah, had what Dr. Chen had described as early symptoms of radiation exposure. Nothing we could do for her except keep her hydrated and comfortable. Her husband, Michael, had been a construction worker. He offered to help secure the station in exchange for shelter. With Greta gone, we needed the help, so we agreed. He immediately set about reinforcing the doors and windows using materials from an abandoned hardware store nearby. By midday, we had 3 more groups asking for shelter. 14 people total, including the first family. Our small station wasn't designed to house this many. We had just 2 bathrooms, limited water, and dwindling food supplies. But turning them away felt impossible. Darius found a solution. The station had a fenced equipment yard where we'd always stored our transmission gear and vehicles. He organized the refugees to set up a small camp there, using tarps and materials Michael helped gather. It wasn't ideal, but it was safer than the open road. I kept broadcasting, now with updated information coming directly from the refugees. They brought news from places we hadn't heard from before. Small towns where people were organizing, farms that were sharing food, a clinic run by veterinarians using animal medicines to treat people. One teenage boy who arrived that afternoon had walked from the coast. His description of the destruction in New Haven was the most detailed we'd heard. The harbor area completely demolished, buildings flattened for blocks. He'd seen a container ship thrown onto land like a toy. But he also shared something else, a rumor that military ships had been spotted offshore, not attacking, not landing, just observing. Foreign vessels monitoring the destruction. I didn't broadcast that part. Some information seemed too dangerous to share without confirmation. That night, we had 23 people sleeping in and around the station. Darius and I took turns standing watch from the roof. During my shift, I saw distant lights to the west, too organized to be random fires, too structured to be refugees. They moved in patterns like coordinated groups. Military, Darius said when I pointed them out, or whatever's left of it. Why aren't they helping? I asked. Maybe they are, he replied, just not here. In the morning, I counted the remaining food supplies. Even with strict rationing, we had maybe 3 days left for all these people. I would need to make another supply run soon, this time going further afield since the nearby stores had been picked clean. The thought of venturing further from the station filled me with dread, especially after my last encounter, but there was no choice. Michael volunteered to come with me. He knew how to handle himself, he said. I believed him. The way he constantly scanned his surroundings, the quiet way he moved. He'd clearly adapted to the new world faster than I had. First light tomorrow, I told him. We'll take the van and go west away from Hartford. He nodded. I'll be ready. Day 7 began with a hard choice. Our generator fuel was running dangerously low. We needed to extend it as long as possible, which meant cutting back on broadcast time even further. 2 hours on, 10 hours off became our new schedule. It felt like abandoning people who depended on us, but Darius insisted it was necessary. Once the generator dies, we're done, he explained, checking fuel levels. If we're careful, we might get another 2 weeks. If not, maybe 3 days. Darius was the heart of our operation now. He'd turned our outdated equipment into a lifeline, constantly adjusting, repairing, improvising. That morning, he showed me how he'd modified our antenna to boost our signal strength without using more power. Should give us another 20 miles of range, he said proudly. Maybe more at night when atmospheric conditions are better. He had this way of making the impossible seem routine, like all problems could be solved with enough wire, duct tape, and ingenuity. When I told him we needed better early warning if anyone approached the station, he rigged tripwires connected to small bells around the perimeter. When our flashlight batteries died, he wired car batteries to LED lights he salvaged from abandoned vehicles. That day, Darius announced he needed to check our remote transmitter, a small relay station about 5 miles away that extended our broadcast range westward. He insisted on going alone. It's a one-person job, he said, and someone needs to keep broadcasting. I didn't like it, but he was right. He took our smallest vehicle, an old station scooter that barely ran, promising to be back before dark. I watched him disappear down the access road, that familiar knot of dread growing in my stomach. With Michael's help, I organized the refugees at the station into teams, some to collect rainwater, others to reinforce our perimeter, still others to care for the sick and injured. Sarah's fever had broken, but she remained weak. Their children had started playing with the other kids, something close to normal in a world that was anything but. I did my afternoon broadcast, sharing what little news we had, reading messages from the bulletin board, and offering practical advice on water purification and avoiding radiation hotspots. After signing off, I went to the roof to watch for Darius. Hours passed, no sign of him. As dusk approached, Michael joined me on the roof. "He should have been back by now," I said, not taking my eyes off the road. "Want me to go look for him?" I shook my head. "We'll give him until morning." But morning came, and Darius didn't. I tried raising him on our emergency radios. Nothing. The knot in my stomach tightened. I gathered a small search party, myself, Michael, and 2 stronger refugees who volunteered. We took the van and headed toward the relay station. We found the scooter abandoned about halfway there, hidden in the underbrush beside the road. No sign of struggle, no blood, no indication of what had happened. Just an empty vehicle, carefully concealed. At the relay station, the door hung open. Inside, the equipment had been meticulously maintained. Typical Darius. He'd clearly made it this far and completed his work. But there was no sign of him. We called his name, searched the surrounding area, found nothing. On the way back, we stopped at every house and building, calling for him. At a small gas station, we found signs of recent activity: food wrappers, a makeshift bed, and Darius's toolkit, the one he never went anywhere without. But no Darius. When we returned to the station, I had to do the hardest broadcast of my life. I announced Darius was missing and described him, asking anyone with information to come to the station. My voice cracked several times, but I forced myself to continue. Then I moved on to the regular announcements: weather, road conditions, safest travel routes. The show had to go on. After the broadcast, I sat alone in the booth for a long time, staring at the controls. Everything in this room represented Darius: patched cables, modified equipment, handwritten instructions taped to every surface. He taught me the basics of running the equipment, but the deeper knowledge, the real understanding of how it all worked, that was his domain. I realized with growing dread that if anything broke down now, I might not be able to fix it. The responsibility of keeping the station running now fell entirely on me. That night I couldn't sleep. I went through Darius's notes, trying to understand his systems. Most were incomprehensible to me: diagrams, calculations, technical jargon. But I found a folder labeled Emergency Procedures with step-by-step instructions for common problems. He'd prepared for this possibility, even if neither of us had acknowledged it might happen. By morning of day 8, I had to accept the reality. Darius wasn't coming back. Whether he'd been taken, injured, or simply decided to leave didn't matter. What mattered was that our small community at the station, now 27 people, was depending on me to keep the information flowing, to be their link to whatever remained of the outside world. I made sure every broadcast began with a description of Darius and a plea for information. But as days passed, hope faded. Some of the refugees suggested he might have headed west to find his family in Massachusetts. Others thought he might have been captured by one of the armed groups we'd seen on the highways. I tried not to imagine worse scenarios. On the evening of day 10, a young girl staying at the station came to me with a folded paper. "I heard you talking about Darius on the radio," she said. "I saw him." My heart jumped. "Where? When?" "2 days ago. Some men had him in a truck. They stopped for water at the creek where my mom and I were hiding. I heard one of them call him the radio guy." My blood went cold. "Did you hear where they were taking him?" She shook her head. "But they had guns, and the truck had a symbol painted on it. Like this." She opened the paper to reveal a crude drawing of a lightning bolt. I'd seen that symbol before, on the bulletin board. Messages warning people to avoid the eastern suburbs where a group called the Voltmen had taken over a power substation, charging desperate people for access to the little electricity they could generate. They'd taken Darius for his technical knowledge. I was sure of it. And if they had him working for them, it explained why our emergency radios had picked up strange signals the last few days. Brief bursts of static at regular intervals, almost like a code. I went back to his notes with renewed purpose. If he was trying to communicate, I needed to understand how. But the technical aspects were beyond me. After hours of frustration, I made a decision. I would continue broadcasting, continue running the station as best I could, but I would not attempt to rescue Darius alone. The risk was too great, not just to me, but to everyone who depended on our broadcasts. Instead, I added a new message to each broadcast, a description of the Voltmen, their location, and a warning to stay away. If Darius could hear us, he would know we hadn't forgotten him. It was all I could do. Days 9 and 10 changed everything. Word had spread about our little sanctuary on the hill. Maybe too far, too fast. We had become known as a place with food, water, and information, all precious commodities in this new world. And that made us a target. The first warning came from a teenage boy who arrived breathless at our door just after dawn on day 9. He'd been traveling with his family when they encountered a roadblock about 5 miles south. Not military, not police, just armed men demanding payment for passage. They were asking everyone where they were heading, the boy told me. When my dad mentioned the radio station, they got real interested. Asked a bunch of questions about how many people you have, what kind of supplies. Michael immediately strengthened our perimeter, organizing the more capable refugees into watch shifts. I used the next broadcast to warn people approaching from the south to use alternate routes, trying to be vague enough that I wouldn't give away our defensive preparations while still protecting innocent travelers. That afternoon, a pickup truck drove slowly past the station entrance. 3 men inside, all wearing red bandanas. They didn't stop, just observed, taking their time. I watched them through binoculars from the roof. The driver looked straight at me and smiled. They returned after dark. This time, 2 trucks, at least 6 men. They parked just beyond our perimeter, lights off, engines running. After 15 minutes, they left without approaching. They were testing us, measuring our response, looking for weaknesses. "They'll come tomorrow night," Michael predicted. "They're waiting to see if we call for help, if reinforcements arrive." "Should we evacuate?" I asked. "Where would everyone go?" he replied, looking at the refugees who had found shelter with us. "The road is more dangerous now. At least here we have walls." We spent that night preparing. Michael distributed makeshift weapons, wrenches, pipes, kitchen knives. Nothing that could match guns, but better than nothing. I moved our most critical broadcasting equipment into the transmitter room, the most secure part of the station with its reinforced walls. If we lost the main building, I could still broadcast from there, at least for a while. I also prepared an emergency transmission, pre-recorded, giving the coordinates of our location and a plea for help. It would broadcast automatically if I activated the emergency system. I didn't tell anyone about this. Hope felt dangerous now, almost like a liability. Day 10 dawned gray and misty. Perfect cover for an attack. I canceled the morning broadcast to conserve generator fuel, telling everyone we needed to save power for emergencies. The truth was, I feared the broadcast might be the signal for an attack. By mid-afternoon, the mist had burned off, but the tension remained. I went to the roof with binoculars, scanning the approaches to the station. Nothing unusual, just the empty highway and abandoned cars we'd grown accustomed to. I was about to climb back down when I caught movement in the trees to the west. Just a flash. Could have been an animal. Then another. And another. People moving through the woods trying to stay concealed, at least a dozen, approaching from multiple directions. I sounded the alarm. 3 quick rings of the old station bell we'd restored for just this purpose. Everyone moved to their assigned positions. Children and the injured were secured in the central storage room. Anyone who could stand took up defensive positions at windows and doors. They came just before sunset. Not the careful, probing approach I'd expected, but a direct rush from multiple directions. 2 pickup trucks roaring up the access road, men with rifles firing from the beds. More on foot, emerging from the woods with handguns and makeshift weapons of their own. The first shots shattered windows, sending glass flying. I heard screams from inside the station, the thunder of footsteps as people scrambled for cover. Michael was shouting orders, trying to coordinate our defense. I ran for the broadcast booth. The main power went out, they'd hit the generator. Emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a sickly blue glow. I reached the booth, sealed the reinforced door behind me, and activated the emergency system. My pre-recorded message began broadcasting immediately, repeating on a loop. Through the booth's small window, I could see them entering the main lobby. 3 men with guns, kicking in doors, shouting for everyone to get down. Michael confronted them with nothing but a pipe wrench. I watched in horror as one of them raised his gun. I didn't think. I grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted by the booth door and burst out, discharging it directly in their faces. The white cloud gave Michael the distraction he needed. He swung the wrench, connecting with the gunman's arm. The weapon clattered to the floor. Everything blurred after that. Fighting in the hallways. Someone swinging at me with a knife. The taste of blood in my mouth. Being backed into a corner, certain these were my final moments. Then a sound cut through the chaos. Engines, different from the pickup trucks. Heavier, military. Shouts from outside, then gunfire, but organized, disciplined. The men who had attacked us were suddenly fleeing, dropping weapons, scrambling for exits. I made it to a window in time to see 2 Humvees in the parking lot. National Guardsmen moving in formation toward the building. Not many, maybe 8 soldiers total, but equipped and trained. The remaining attackers were surrendering, hands raised. The National Guard lieutenant who entered was named Rodriguez. She assessed the situation quickly, efficiently. 2 of our people were injured, 1 seriously. None dead, miraculously. 3 attackers killed, 4 captured. The rest had escaped. "We intercepted your emergency broadcast," she told me when things had calmed down. "We have a forward operating base about 15 miles north. Been trying to secure key infrastructure." "Why haven't you made contact before?" I demanded. "We've been broadcasting for 10 days. "Our orders were to secure the perimeter first, then move inward," she replied evenly. "Communications, power stations, water treatment plants. We're stretched thin. This is the first time we've been able to respond to a civilian distress call." They couldn't stay, couldn't spare the personnel to guard us, but they gave us some supplies, medicine, food, ammunition for the few guns we had. Most importantly, they gave us a radio tuned to their emergency frequency. "You keep broadcasting," Lieutenant Rodriguez told me. "People need it. We'll check in when we can." After they left, taking the prisoners with them, I surveyed the damage. Windows shattered, doors broken, walls bullet-riddled, But the core of the station was intact. The transmitter still worked. We could rebuild the rest. That night I broadcast again, voice shaking but determined. I told the truth about the attack, about the National Guard response. People needed to know both the dangers and the hope. "We're still here," I said into the microphone. "We survived, and we'll keep broadcasting." Days 11 through 13 were about rebuilding. The attack had left us shaken but more determined than ever. With Michael leading the effort, we repaired windows with plywood, reinforced doors with metal salvaged from abandoned cars, and established a proper watch rotation. The refugees who had initially come seeking shelter now considered themselves part of our community. They took ownership of the station's defense and maintenance. Our biggest concern remained power. The generator had been damaged in the attack, and while Michael managed to get it running again, it wouldn't last much longer. Fuel was running critically low. I estimated we had maybe 3 days of broadcast time left, and that was being generous. I established a new broadcast schedule: 1 hour at dawn, 1 at noon, 1 at dusk. Each transmission began with the same message: "This is Millstone Emergency Broadcast. We are still operating. If you can hear this, you are not alone." Then I would share what information we had, read messages from people searching for loved ones, and provide practical advice for survival. The National Guard radio remained silent. We tried calling them several times a day but received no response. Lieutenant Rodriguez had warned us they might be out of range for extended periods, but the silence was still unnerving. On the morning of day 13, the power grid failed completely. Up until then, there had been occasional flickers of electricity, brief moments when a light would turn on or a radio would buzz. Ghosts in the system. Now nothing. Whatever emergency systems had kept portions of the grid limping along had finally given up. That same day, our main generator sputtered to a stop and wouldn't restart. Michael spent hours trying to fix it, covered in grease and swearing under his breath. Finally, he emerged from the generator room with a grim expression. "Fuel pumps completely shot," he announced, "and we're out of diesel anyway." We switched to our backup, a small portable generator Darius had modified to run on multiple fuel types. It provided enough power for the transmitter and basic lighting, nothing more. And even that would only last a day or two. I made a decision then that I had been avoiding. We needed to recover equipment from other radio stations. If Millstone was going to continue broadcasting, we needed parts, batteries, solar panels if possible. That meant I would have to leave the station. The nearest alternative was WHRT in Hartford, about 20 miles east. Going there meant entering the city, which everyone agreed was dangerous. But they had a rooftop solar array that had been installed just last year. If it was intact, it could power our transmitter indefinitely. I announced my plan during the evening broadcast, explaining that transmissions would be suspended for at least a day while I made the journey. The response was immediate. When I signed off, Michael and 4 others were waiting outside the booth. "You're not going alone," Michael said simply. We spent that night planning. One of the refugees, a woman named Elena, had worked in Hartford until the attacks. She drew detailed maps of the city center, marking potential danger zones and the safest approach to the WHRT building. Another refugee, an older man who had been a truck driver, gave us information about which bridges were likely still passable. By morning, we had a plan. Michael, Elena, and I would take the van. The others would maintain the station, using the emergency radio to contact the National Guard if needed. If we weren't back in 3 days, they should assume the worst and consider evacuating to the Guard's forward operating base. We left at first light on day 14. The highway was clearer than I expected. Someone had been moving abandoned vehicles to create a passable lane. Military, most likely. We made good time until we reached the outskirts of Hartford. The city was a shell of itself. buildings stood intact but empty, streets deserted except for paper and debris blowing in the wind. Occasionally, we saw small groups of people moving quickly, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Nobody seemed interested in challenging our van. As we got closer to the city center, the destruction became more evident. Several buildings had collapsed completely. Others showed impact damage from what Elena suggested were helicopter crashes. The streets were littered with abandoned emergency vehicles, police cars, ambulances, fire trucks. WHRT occupied the 15th floor of an office building downtown. When we arrived, the entrance was blocked by a collapsed awning. We had to break through a service entrance in the back. Inside, the building was dark and silent. The stairwell smelled of mold and something worse. We used flashlights, moving carefully, listening for any sound that might indicate we weren't alone. 15 flights of stairs later, breathless and sweating, we reached WHRT's offices. The door was locked. Michael forced it open with a crowbar. Inside, everything was eerily undisturbed, desks with coffee cups still on them, computers positioned as if their users had just stepped away. The broadcast booth glass was shattered, equipment damaged, but much of what we needed appeared salvageable. We worked quickly, disconnecting solar controllers, batteries, and the smaller transmitter components. Michael found tools and began dismantling what couldn't be carried intact. Elena kept watch by the stairwell door. We were nearly finished when Elena hissed a warning. Voices coming up the stairs. Multiple people, not trying to be quiet. We doused our flashlights and hid behind the reception desk. The voices grew louder. Not the disciplined communication of military personnel, but the casual conversation of people who felt at home in this environment. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The radio guy says this equipment is compatible with what we've got. We just need the converter panels from the roof. Radio guy. Darius. It had to be. The Voltman had brought him here to salvage equipment, just as we were doing. I exchanged glances with Michael. We were outnumbered, probably outgunned. But if Darius was with them, this might be our only chance to help him. As footsteps entered the reception area, I made a split-second decision. I stood up from behind the desk, hands raised. "We're just here for parts," I said to the startled faces of 4 men with guns. No trouble. For a moment, no one moved. 4 men with weapons aimed at my chest, faces registering surprise, then calculation. Michael slowly stood up beside me, hands also raised. Helena remained hidden, our one advantage if things went bad. "You're the voice," one of them said finally, a tall man with a red bandana tied around his arm. "From the radio station on the hill." I nodded. "Adam Reeves, Millstone Emergency Broadcast." The tall man gestured for the others to lower their weapons slightly. "Javier," he introduced himself, "we've been listening to your broadcasts. Useful information." He said it like he was evaluating livestock at a fair. "We need parts to keep broadcasting," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. "Our generator failed." "Tough luck," Javier replied, not sounding particularly sympathetic. "This building is now Voltman territory. Everything in it belongs to us." "We have a working vehicle," Michael offered carefully. "Full tank of gas. Trade for the solar equipment?" Javier seemed to consider this, but then another voice called from the hallway. "What's the holdup? We need to get this done before dark." My heart jumped. I knew that voice. Darius appeared in the doorway looking thinner, exhausted, a healing cut visible above his eye. He froze when he saw me, emotions flickering across his face too quickly to read. "Adam?" His voice cracked slightly. "He knows you?" Javier asked sharply. Darius recovered quickly. "He's the DJ I told you about from Millstone." He tried to sound casual, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight shake in his hands. "Your old station," Javier nodded. "Well, this is convenient. You said we needed more people who understand radio equipment. Here's one delivered right to us." The implication was clear. They weren't planning to let us leave. "We're expected back," I said quickly. "Our people will come looking for us." Javier laughed. "Your people? The civilians playing soldier on that hill? We've been watching your station for days. You've got maybe 20 people, half of them kids or old folks." My mind raced. If they'd been watching us, they knew exactly how vulnerable we were. The attack on day 10 hadn't been random. It had been a scouting mission, gathering intelligence for something bigger. Darius caught my eye and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head, warning me not to reveal anything else. "Look," I tried again. "We can help each other. You clearly need technical expertise. We need power. Why fight over scraps when we could combine resources?" Javier seemed amused by this. "Combine resources? You mean you give us your station's location on high ground, and we give you what? Protection. You've seen what happened to people who counted on protection from the government, from the military." "We have reliable information," I countered. "Contact with National Guard units, weather data, radiation maps." This caught his attention. "What? National Guard units?" Before I could answer, we heard a new sound. Rotors. A helicopter close and getting closer. Everyone froze, listening. Helicopters meant military. Military meant either help or a threat, depending on which side you were on. "Get away from the windows," Javier ordered sharply. His men complied instantly, moving to interior walls. Darius used the distraction to move closer to me. "They've taken over the power substation on Brainerd Road," he whispered urgently. 50 men at least. They're planning to expand, take more territory." "What do they want with radio equipment?" I whispered back. "Communication network. They're coordinating with other groups in Massachusetts, Rhode Island. Organizing." The helicopter sound grew louder, then began to fade as it passed over. "We need to move," Javier announced. "Take these two with us. Leave the woman." I stiffened. They didn't know Elena was here. Maybe she could escape, get back to the station, warn the others. "She's not part of this," I agreed quickly. "Just a guide we hired to get us through the city." Javier nodded to two of his men. "Search the rest of the floor. Make sure we're not walking into an ambush." As the men moved past the reception desk, Elena made her move. She burst from hiding, shoving one man into the other, and sprinted for the stairwell. Gunshots rang out, but she was already gone, footsteps echoing as she raced downstairs. "Let her go," Javier ordered as one man moved to pursue. "She won't get far in the city alone." He turned back to us. "As for you two, you're coming with us. We could use a proper radio announcer to get our message out." They marched us down 15 flights of stairs and into the parking garage where their vehicles waited. 3 pickup trucks with the lightning bolt symbol painted on the doors. They took our equipment too, loading the solar panels and electronics we'd collected. Darius and I were separated, placed in different vehicles. As they drove us out of the city, I tried to memorize the route, looking for landmarks, anything that might help if we managed to escape. We arrived at a sprawling electrical substation surrounded by chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Inside the fence, dozens of people moved with purpose, some carrying weapons, others working on equipment. Not just a gang, a community, a dangerous one. They led us to a small control building. Inside, the walls were covered with maps, the entire region marked with symbols and notations. Territory claimed, resources identified, potential targets. And there, marked with a large red X, was Millstone Emergency Broadcast Station. References to community efforts that were suspiciously organized. collection points that sounded more like checkpoints. After the broadcast ended, Javier seemed pleased. "You're a natural," he said. "The voice of the New World Order." "Just doing what I have to," I replied evenly. He studied me for a moment. "You know, in time, you might see this isn't so bad. We're building something here. Order from chaos. Structure. Protection. That's what people need now." "At what cost?" I asked. "Survival always has a cost," he answered simply. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Darius and I were returned to our separate quarters, given meals, brought out for equipment checks. No sign that our message had been received, no indication that help was coming. I began to lose hope. Then, just after sunset, everything changed. The lights went out all at once. Complete darkness fell over the compound. Seconds later, the emergency generators kicked in, casting everything in dim red light. Alarms began to sound. "Perimeter breach, east fence," someone shouted. Gunfire erupted, sharp and disciplined, not the Voltmen's usual wild shooting, more like military. My guard rushed me back to my cell, locked the door, and ran toward the commotion. I pressed my face to the small window, trying to see what was happening. Flashes of gunfire illuminated the darkness. Voices shouted orders. The sound of engines grew louder. Heavy vehicles approaching fast. My door burst open. Darius stood there, a ring of keys in his hand, face split in a wild grin. "National Guard," he gasped, and "they got the message. They're hitting all the major Voltman positions simultaneously." We ran through the chaos, ducking from building to building, avoiding the main fight. Darius seemed to know exactly where to go, which areas would be clear. He'd been planning this, I realized, mapping escape routes during his captivity. We reached the perimeter fence just as a section of it came down under the weight of an armored vehicle. National Guard troops poured through the gap, moving with practiced efficiency. Lieutenant Rodriguez was among them. She spotted us, recognition flashing in her eyes. "The radio operators," she called to her team. "Secure them." 2 soldiers escorted us to a Humvee behind their lines. As we drove away from the compound, I watched the Voltman's operation being systematically dismantled. Not destroyed. Reclaimed. "Your message saved a lot of lives," Rodriguez told us once we were clear. "We've been tracking the Voltmen for days, but couldn't pinpoint their main base or determine their numbers. You gave us exactly what we needed." "The people from our station," I asked urgently. "Do you know if they're safe?" She nodded. "Already recovered. One of our units found them at a warehouse about 10 miles from here. They're at our forward operating base now." Relief flooded through me, so powerful I nearly wept. "And the station, Millstone?" "Damaged, but salvageable," she replied. "We've secured it. Strategic communications asset." Darius and I exchanged a look. Our little station, suddenly important enough for military protection. The world had indeed changed in 19 days. "I need to get back on air," I said. "People have been listening. They need to know what's happening." Rodriguez considered this, then nodded. "We can arrange that. The military could use a civilian voice people already trust." The Humvee carried us through the night, back toward Millstone, back toward what remained of our world. As we drove, Darius told me how he'd been captured while checking the relay station, how he'd convinced the Voltmen he could be useful, how he'd learned their operations while planning an escape. "I knew you'd keep broadcasting," he said. "I knew you'd find a way to reach me." When we arrived at Millstone just before dawn, I felt like I was returning from a different lifetime. The small crowd that greeted us included Michael, bruised but standing tall, Sarah with her children, and the other refugees who had become our community. And someone else, Greta, our station manager. She had made it to Vermont, established contact with functioning government remnants there, and returned with news of organized relief efforts pushing south. As the sun rose on day 20, I took my place behind the microphone again. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders, but now shared with others. Darius, back at his engineering post, Greta managing communications with the National Guard and other emerging centers of civilization, a refugee community becoming something more permanent. "This is Adam Reeves of Millstone Emergency Broadcast," I began, feeling the weight of those 19 days in every word. "We are still on air. The situation is stabilizing. Help is coming. If you can hear my voice, you are not alone. And if you're out there trying to rebuild, trying to connect, know that there are others doing the same. We survived the first wave. Now we begin the long work of finding each other again." The world that had ended 19 days ago would never return. But as I spoke into the microphone, watching dawn break over a landscape forever changed, I realized something new was already being born from its ashes. Something we were all creating together, broadcast by broadcast, connection by connection, day by day. And as long as voices could reach across the distance between us, there was hope.